Afternoon, everyone. We're excited about having you here today for this webinar on autonomous vehicle policy and regulations, a discussion on the current landscape and future of AVs. We'll start in just a few minutes. Hello, everyone. So again, welcome to our event. So I would like to just go over some housekeeping items before we begin our presentation and our conversation. The first is that this event is being recorded and our recording will be posted online afterwards. You can hide the captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button. And there are speaker biographies and slides available online at urban.org. As you might see, we have an ASL interpreter for those who need that, also present throughout the conversation. All participants will be muted throughout the conversation, but you will be able to type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time during this conversation. So feel free, if you have questions or thoughts, to please put them in there throughout. Please also take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey that will be distributed in the chat at the end of the event. And if you have thoughts or discussion items you would like to share during the event, please engage with us online at #live@urban. So I'm going to go ahead and begin with a presentation. I'm excited to be sharing some of the results of our new report on regulating autonomous vehicles, also known as AVs or self-driving cars, which we've been working on for the past few months, and which is a collaboration between myself, Yona Freemark, Tina Stacy, Olivia Fiel, Jorge Morales Burnett, and Sophia Wang. Our report is now published on the Urban website as of today, and you can check it out. We're excited about this research subject as it builds on our goal of creating a society in the United States that is more socially and racially equitable, where being more environmentally sustainable is possible. Ultimately, we think that AVs can play an important role in improving the US transportation system, but only if they are regulated appropriately. So I'll begin with an overview of the findings and recommendations from our report before turning it over to our panelist discussion, which is going to involve a number of people who we think will give great insight into this issue. So I'd like to begin with this. Part of the reason we're interested in AVs, or autonomous vehicles, is that unfortunately, there are so many problems with the transportation system in the United States today. The vast majority of Americans are car dependent. They rely on driving to perform almost every task in their day-to-day lives. Almost 80% of Americans drive alone to work. This car dependence has produced some major problems. In the US alone, tens of thousands of annual deaths and hundreds of thousands of annual injuries on the roads. Inequitable access to opportunity for those without cars and those who can't drive. High costs of transportation that make getting around difficult for people with low incomes who are disproportionately people of color. Disinvestment in urban areas and destruction of sensitive ecological areas. And finally, massive exposure to lung disease causing air particulates, noise pollution, and release of climate change producing carbon dioxide. Now, we therefore need to be asking whether there are opportunities for new technologies to alter this situation. Is there anything we can do to resolve so many of the problems related to car dependency in a way that improves transportation safety, reduces transportation costs, minimizes use of single occupancy cars, and eliminates emissions from transportation? We know that the most effective strategy is to invest in communities that are designed around walking, biking, and taking transit. These modes of transportation are more environmentally friendly, more likely to produce positive outcomes for our communities, and more likely to be affordable enough for everyone to use. But given American society's built form, the reality is that it is mostly designed around cars. it is unlikely that we can move the majority of trips out of those cars anytime soon. So the question for us is, can car-sized AVs help us along a successful path in the direction of a more equitable and environmentally friendly society? Do they offer a key strategy in this direction? So we began undertaking a new research program with the explicit goal of trying to understand how AVs would impact the US transportation system overall, and specifically in terms of social equity and the environment. We wanted to identify whether there were specific regulations that could help address deficiencies that were raised by the deployment of these vehicles. To begin to answer these questions, we undertook a variety of research methods. We interviewed key stakeholders representing the automotive industry, advocates, and government officials. We reviewed dozens of research papers, and we examined hundreds of proposed and enacted laws across the state and federal levels. So before we get into our findings, let's begin with a quick overview of what we mean by autonomous vehicles in the first place. The reality is that AVs might best be defined as cars with some level of driving assistance. They are not necessarily fully self-driving robots that can make all the necessary decisions on the road. Indeed, many cars on the market today, as I'm sure you've seen, use advanced driver assistance systems called ADAS to assist human drivers. Examples include adaptive cruise control. But even in cars with advanced assistance, like Tesla's autopilot systems, drivers have to monitor all actions of the vehicle. They can't simply fall asleep and let the car go. But soon we'll have access to more advanced automated driving systems that can drive unmonitored some or all of the time. These are the self-driving vehicles that could be truly transformative in terms of making a transformation of American society possible, at least if they're regulated appropriately. Now, in conducting our research, we went through reams of scholarship and interviewed stakeholders from multiple perspectives to get a clear sense as possible about what we might expect from these self-driving cars. In what ways might we expect them to support a beneficial transformation of US society? And in what ways might we expect them to worsen existing problems? From a positive perspective, we found that AVs could, at least in theory, be better at driving than human drivers. That could make it feasible for AVs to avoid significant numbers of collisions and prevent the increase in traffic crashes that is now currently plaguing the United States. AVs could reduce the cost of using transportation, especially through ride-hailing, since they would not require labor, or at least much less of it than traditional cars. AVs could thus increase access to opportunity for people who are currently left out of the transportation system. And they could provide mobility for people who don't have great access to transit and don't have the ability to drive today. And finally, because they're new technology, AVs could be integrated into the electric vehicle ecosystem, which has been much discussed over the last few months, thus reducing emissions. At the same time, AVs could also produce a series of very negative consequences on the world around us. Those reduced travel costs that I mentioned, both in terms of financial costs and time costs, could encourage more car travel. All this additional driving could mean more traffic and more emissions. Even if those emissions are limited and AVs are electrified, they still might produce dangerous air particulates from tire and brake wear, causing lung disease. Cheaper travel costs, in addition, could encourage more movement of people outside of cities. This could result in ecological destruction of sensitive wildlife land, reduce central city investment, and increase employment in areas far from people of color and people with low incomes. This could ultimately be quite a negative set of outcomes. These positives and these negatives really depend on answers to questions about AVs that we don't entirely know yet. Part of the issue is that we just don't know much about AVs since they're currently still in early testing, especially the self-driving versions of them. So some questions we need to be asking are, number one, will AVs actually be better than people at preventing crashes? Number two, will AV rides through ride-hailing be affordable for people with low incomes? Will AV ride-hailing providers offer equitable services to neighborhoods where people of color and households with low incomes predominate? Will AVs actually be designed to reduce environmental harms? Will consumer-available AVs induce more outward development? And will AVs be electric? And if so, will those benefits outweigh the potential harms of increased travel on the roads? In our research, we acknowledge the uncertainties regarding AV deployment, but we also believe strongly that given the potential negative impacts of AVs, we need to develop a regulatory environment at multiple levels of government that is designed to address them. In our report, we get into many details of how these regulations could look, but I'm going to summarize them really briefly for you all here. From the perspective of AV design, we do think there is merit in expanding testing, but we need to ensure that those AVs on the road are safer than human-driven cars, that they are zero emissions, and that they are accessible to all people. From the perspective of vehicle operations, governments need to collect data on collisions and trips to be able to track safety and equity of operations. From the perspective of consumer standards, governments may consider developing financial mechanisms to encourage ride pooling rather than private AV ownership, while subsidizing the use of AVs by people with low incomes. And from the perspective of street standards, local governments need to create supports for AVs to allow for communal use of streets while ensuring that over-policing is avoided. Together, we think that the ensemble of regulations like these can help ensure that AVs produce more environmentally sustainable, socially equitable outcomes, rather than furthering the problems with the current transportation system. Finally, I just wanted to note that regulations for AVs in the US will have to be undertaken by multiple levels of government. We expect that federal, state, and local policymakers all will have significant roles to play in vehicle design, vehicle operation, consumer standards, and street standards. Together, they can work to identify regulatory approaches that truly benefit the public. All this and more is available in our report, but now I would like to turn it over to our panel. Our panel is made up of a group of people who we asked to join us here, but they do absolutely not represent the opinion of our report, which was produced by researchers at the Urban Institute alone. So I'm going to welcome our panelists and ask them to show themselves, show their video. And I'm also going to have them introduce themselves. So let's begin with Hillary. Just provide us a 1 or 2 sentence summary of yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Hillary Kane. I'm Vice President for Technology, Innovation, and Mobility Policy at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We are the primary association here in Washington, D.C. that represents the auto industry.
Anil.
My name is Anil Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind, the most transformative civil rights organization of blind people across this country. Pleasure to be here.
Alante.
Hello, my name is Dr. Alante Whitmore, and I'm the director of the AV initiative at SAFE. And so I spend most of my time thinking about equity, how we can increase access, and I'm very happy to be here.
And Ariel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. Ariel Wolf. I'm a partner at Venable and the chair of the Autonomous and Connected Mobility Practice Group there. And in that capacity, work with clients across the autonomous vehicle and connected mobility space.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to have you all here today. I'd like to actually begin with a broad question, which is there one thing that you can point to that most excites you about AVs? And is there one thing that most concerns you about AVs? So let me go to Anil first, actually, for that.
Sure. I mean, what excites me is what excites me for millions of other people in this country with disabilities who have limited options for transportation, and the fact that AVs will provide an accessible means for us to travel from point A to point B much more independently. That's extremely exciting. What most frightens me is that the move toward the implementation of this technology is going to be subjected to the societal fears that we as people with disabilities have to deal with every day. So I'm hoping that we are able to educate the public in a way that those fears can be cast aside, and we can look at this from an objective fashion and recognize the true benefits that it will have for not just people with disabilities, but for everybody.
Ariel?
Sure. Well, there's so much that excites me about the prospect of the safe and swift deployment of autonomous vehicles. But really what has to come at the top in my mind is the the ability for that technology to address the safety crisis on our roads. It's getting worse. The numbers, every subsequent release of data from US DOT and other sources of information are clear that what we're seeing is really an epidemic of violence on our roads. That's the result of, as was reaffirmed earlier this year by the US Department of Transportation, the overwhelming cause of crashes on our roads is due to one or more human behavioral factors. So autonomous vehicle technology has the ability to address that. I think the other side of the ledger, what's concerning is, if I can do a little jujitsu and flip it around, is just to say what's concerning is that the technology may not make its way out. And I think just to be a little bit more specific there, it would be as a result of a little bit of conflation or a lot of conflation that goes on between driver assist technology and autonomous vehicle technology. When we talk about autonomous, it's really about level 4, fully autonomous, as some call it, where it performs all aspects of the driving task. So that conflation is concerning to me, it's concerning to the industry, and hopefully we can address it.
Hillary?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that's been said so far. I mean, I'm really moved by the safety opportunity of the technology, but I think honestly, what excites me the most is the opportunity for the technology to serve the unmet needs of people living with disabilities and people of advanced age. Not only, I would say, by providing independent mobility options, but also by bringing goods and services directly to them. I think this is not something that we talk about a lot, but I personally see a real opportunity for things like mobile stores and mobile healthcare units to be brought directly to people where they reside, making life just generally easier for folks who have limited mobility. And what concerns me the most is that we won't have a regulatory framework in place that supports and fosters the technology here, and that will end up running the AV industry out of the United States.
Nolante.
Yeah, I think everyone made really amazing points. I don't want to become a become an echo chamber, but I'm really excited again for that opportunity to increase access and opportunities for also upward social mobility for individuals. I think there are a lot of opportunities that are going to be available through the technology for the workforce and accelerating our social mobility. As far as my concern, I think Hillary and Ariel really hit the nail on the head. I believe the concern for me is the lack of a framework to bring this technology into the wide scale deployment. We want to have all these great, exciting opportunities and actualizing this potential for the technology, but we have to have a framework in place.
Thank you. So, I think several of you pointed out this issue of the conflation between driver assist software and full self-driving. That is absolutely a major feature of the discussion about, the future of driving overall in the US today. We have levels 1 to 3 autonomous vehicles or AV technology that is just driver assist, as you said. It's assistance that needs driver supervision. And then you have level 4 and 5 AVs that are really about actually allowing people to not have to pay attention to the road at all. And those are fundamentally different in terms of the outcomes they will produce, I think, on the society that we have. But as a lot of you said, there are some questions about whether the regulatory environment is prepped for that sort of full self-driving. So I'm wondering if we could get into that a little bit. Why is there not a regulatory environment right now for that sort of full self-driving? And what are the steps we need to actually get there? And I'll just pass it immediately to Alante since you were last.
Sure. I think that that was an excellent question. I think the missing piece is like when we think about kind of the way that we are organized and structured right now, we have the FMVSS. And so that has the assumption that there's always going to be a human driver. And I don't think that back in the 60s, individuals could have anticipated that we would come to a future point where there's a technology where there is no driver and we need to consider a new type of safety standard. So I think it's not necessarily of anyone's at fault who would have been able to predict this in the future, right? So what is missing, I think, right now is, again, the consideration of this new technology. FMVSS really focuses on the design of the vehicle and the safety around that versus right now, if an autonomous vehicle has all of those pieces, it can be on the road, right? There's opportunities for testing. Technically, there's a pathway for sales. I know that's not happening because developers are thinking and wanting to be proactive in how they are approaching deployment. But I say that to say we have to really think about creating potentially a new approach because we have a new technology that is disrupting the way transportation has been thought of up until now.
So Hillary, what would that approach look like?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's actually a process that's already underway at the Department of Transportation and at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So as Alante said, there are a lot of existing motor vehicle safety standards that are on the books today that reference a human driver, that reference a steering wheel, that reference brake pedals, for example. And if you want to bring an autonomous vehicle to the US market that doesn't have a steering wheel and a brake pedal, that has sort of a non-conventional vehicle design, these standards stand in the way of you being able to do that. So NHTSA has begun the process already. They've been working on it for a while now to go through the existing standards, find the places that create these obstacles for AV deployment and modifying them. They did release their first set of modifications, final modifications a number of months ago, but they have a lot of work ahead of them. There's a lot of standards that they still need to go through and update. And so our hope is that they will continue to work at that with a tremendous sense of urgency and get it done as quickly as possible.
So from your perspective, and I think this really applies to anybody on the call, what is the timeline looking like? I mean, how quickly could a federal development of regulations actually move forward realistically?
I'm happy to. Oh, please, Anil.
Can I attempt to address that by bridging an answer to the previous question as well? I think
absolutely
the whole level 1 through 5 may have been an error. I think labeling them level 1 through 3 is good because we are still talking about the contemporary configuration of an automobile. And to their credit, I think that adding the assistive driving features also helped shape the public's paradigm around safety, because I talk to individuals that say, I don't want technology driving my car, but then I point out, you have lane maintenance, you have auto braking, all those things are already there. So it's getting people more comfortable with that automated intervention. But I think that when you jump to level 4 and level 5, it's too big a jump for some people because they still can't equate a car without a steering wheel or without the brake pedals. And maybe we should have just introduced the self-driving vehicle as kind of its own, because that's also the problem within the regulatory process as well, because we're in the process of trying to adapt existing regulations to get exemptions for a steering wheel. No, it should be just, from the start, this is a disruptive technology that should have its own parameter set. And I think it may be easier to develop rules and regulations for something new as opposed to trying to transform the old into the new. So with respect to how soon we can get it done, as soon as we can start shaping the hearts and minds of the public, continue to move that, because again, a lot of fear prohibits that. And, we still are a democracy, and public opinion still does drive public policy, whether we believe that or not. So I'm optimistic that the powers that be and the groups that I'm aware of are doing a good job educating the public more, educating our public officials more. And I think that once we get a good, solid, robust regulatory infrastructure, then things will move forward more exponentially. So I'm hoping, back to our blind driver challenge back in 2011, I was thinking it'd be done by now. So that was a little too optimistic, but I'm hoping within the next 10 years that maybe that people still think that's pretty optimistic.
If it's okay to just provide one additional thought, when we talk about a regulatory framework, and we'll all keep saying it, I think we are in agreement with each other, and few people know more about this than I know, than Hillary, who's been working on this for a long time, as well as my other co-panelists. But I tend to think of it this way: what are the objectives of the framework? And I think of it in 3 ways from a policy perspective. The first is enhancing consumer trust. That has to be done, and no one's getting in these vehicles unless they believe it's safe. And so that can be done from a regulatory perspective in a number of ways. There's the traditional FMVSS, which is going to be difficult in this context because of the various operational design domains, and to do that for each one would be very difficult. So there are other ideas being put forward, like a safety case, and then there's data sharing, which is occurring through NHTSA's standing general order and other voluntary initiatives. So that's, you got to enhance the consumer trust first and foremost. But coupled with that, we won't be successful unless we also the framework maximizes deployment. And so then coupled with all of that has to be an effort to reduce barriers, and that's where all of these was noted earlier, with FMVSS removing the references, or at least adapting them in that respect, to make sure that new technology can get on. And then the third piece, which is equally important, is it has to promote innovation. So it can't be picking technologies, picking winners and losers and things like that. If a framework accomplishes those three things, then we're going to achieve the objective we all want to see, which is the safe and swift deployment of AVs. And hopefully we can get there. I think it's been some time, but these efforts are non-linear. They could be moving along, and then suddenly we have a breakthrough. So that's what we're hoping for.
So given the reality that we don't know much about AVs right now in terms of their actual operation, because we have such limited testing. In fact, some people on the Zoom webinar may not realize that companies have a limitation right now of the number of cars they can get an exemption from federal standards to actually produce a car that doesn't have a steering wheel, that doesn't have brake pads or things of that sort. So we don't have too much information about how exactly a non-human driven or non-human supervised AV would look or work. But given that fact, and the fact that we want people to feel comfortable, how can we be sure that these cars are actually going to be safe? How can we develop regulations that ensure that sort of safety? What do you all think about that?
I mean, I can jump in and just say, I mean, I think, so we have an agency within the US government that's literally their job, right? So NHTSA's job is literally to make sure that vehicles that are on the US roadways are safe. And that is why they're going through the processes they're going through right now, where they're looking regulation by regulation and figuring out how it can be modified to accommodate AVs and also preserve and protect safety, right? So I think we have to have faith that they are going to do their job, and then once they release updated regulations, that they will strike that balance of allowing for the innovation and potential of this technology while also preserving motor vehicle safety, which is their mission.
Yeah, and I think to balance that, to enhance the nuance of this question, is a lot of people think, and they state that the cars have to be safer than what's available now, and I think that's kind of a bar that's too high. They need to be as safe as, because autonomous vehicles, again, offer so many economies of scale to the current availability of automobile travel. So if they can be proven as safe as, and I think that a lot of it too, I've heard some pretty interesting scenarios that have been described, and people kind of internalize whether that's quote unquote safety. One of the scenarios I heard from some people that were testing California at Dr. Kornhauer's Smart Car Summit in Princeton University was that one of the autonomous vehicles was involved in an accident. And the accident that happened, of course, people only hear, oh, see, AV is unsafe. But what happened is the autonomous vehicle was approaching a stop sign, and it came to a complete stop. So the driver behind the autonomous vehicle actually rear-ended the automobile. So safe is also somewhat subjective, right? Because people will say, well, that proves that autonomous vehicles can't drive in the way that humans do. But they're condemning the autonomous vehicle for following the rules of the road. Safety, I think, is a difficult space. But as said earlier, we've done it before. It shouldn't be impossible.
What do you think about this,
Absolutely.
Alonso?
Yeah, and I the point I want to also bring into this conversation is that NHTSA also has a recall fail-safe, right? And so that's the way that we've been handled right now. Most OEMs are able to self-certify for safety, according to FMVSS, of course. And as autonomous vehicle, and if there is an issue for our traditional conventional human-driven vehicles, if there's an issue, there's a safety recall. And so we still have that lever in place. I know NHTSA will do a recall if necessary. And so remembering that we have not only this effort towards modification of FMVSS, but always have that recall fail-safe to ensure that safety is happening, even with our new vehicles that are automated.
Yeah, no,
Oh, go ahead.
I'll add one thing. I'm an attorney, so I'm trained to see risk everywhere. And not only that, I'm a fan of the New York Mets, so I see doomsday around every corner. I mean, it's coming. So in that respect, right, we have to make sure that the technology is safe. And so there's no question there are risks that are being addressed by the technology innovators, but it has to, I agree with the panelists, it has to be measured against the baseline we're seeing right now. And when we lose perspective of that, that's where we go down different rabbit holes, hypotheticals and things like that in the technology, which are important either today or someday. But if we lose that sense of urgency that we have to address, and so that tilts or adapts or shapes the risk posture for how we approach developing a regulatory framework now, and to get things going, get this industry to scale, and be able to adapt that over time.
Thank you. I think it is interesting that you pointed to that. The baseline as the key issue here. I started my presentation pointing out that we do have this major problem in the US, which is that our transportation system is incredibly unsafe. And in fact, when you look at other countries around the world, other developed countries, it's less safe, especially for pedestrians. And so if we can find ways to address that, I think, we'll be better off as a country overall. So one question that is raised by that is whether NHTSA is doing as good of a job as it could on that front. I mean, when you think about it, NHTSA has supervised the transportation system we have today that has a lot of issues. So how can we be sure that NHTSA's approach is going to be effective when it comes to AVs?
Well, I'll offer again from the consumer perspective. One of the ways that we're ensuring is we're actually vocal in that process. So whenever there's an opportunity to offer public comment, to give any experience from our lived experience, to show kind of counterpoints to some of the points that are being made, to make sure that information is balanced. So we're just active in that discussion and making sure that it's not happening within a silo.
I don't want to condemn NHTSA. I think that they have an incredible task ahead of them, and have had such with maintaining the safety of our transportation system. But I think one thing that companies are doing right now is being cooperative, right? By following the SGO that they released, the Standing General Order, to collect data and being a part of that dialogue to help NHTSA make informed decisions. I think that's always going to be critical and helpful in advancing safety.
And I will add that, there has been, up until the last couple of years, incredible progress that was made in bringing traffic fatalities down. If you look at the trajectory over time, up until, again, a couple of years ago, the amount of progress that was made through new vehicle technologies that NHTSA helped enable and facilitate is remarkable. Something happened a couple of years ago in conjunction with the pandemic, where I think it took all of us by surprise to see the numbers tick up the way that they did. And so, I feel bad for the Department of Transportation, for NHTSA, because they're trying to adjust in real time to this unexpected uptick. But I do think it lends itself to the discussion we're having today, which is we're going to have to start thinking creatively about how to address what we've seen over the last couple of years. And my opinion is that new vehicle technologies, such as autonomous vehicle technologies, is the answer, is the silver bullet that we've been looking for to really shift the trajectory going forward.
Now, about 2 years ago, NHTSA instituted a general order that requires any automaker that has a level 3 or above a human assistance or AV system operated that's involved in a collision to report it to NHTSA, and they have been collecting data on that. Do you all support the continuation of that policy? Should that be a standardized policy for AVs into the future?
Yes. The short answer is yes.
I do think there's room. Oh, please, Ariel.
Oh, thanks. I was going to say, it wasn't 2 years. It was 14 months and 22 days, and maybe about 17 hours ago. But who's counting? Remember when it came out? But Look, I think there's really good value in that kind of data collection. There are, I think, things that can be improved with it, just like any kind of instrument that's issued. There are maybe some of the terms need to be updated. And I think NHTSA did a good job in releasing the data and separating the data sets between AV and ADAS and driver assist to show some things that we started to see there. Anil was referring to the crash from the rear. We saw AVs on the AV side predominantly having the incidents that did occur were happening in the rear, and driver assist the opposite. Can what conclusions can you draw from that data set? I don't think we want to jump to any, but there is some value there. I do think there are opportunities to maybe reduce the burdens on companies and some of the vagueness in that instrument, but overall, it's an important step to, again, build that transparency and trust with the public, so they understand. I'll keep saying it, if the public is not trusting the technology to get inside, it could be the greatest AV of all time, but if no one uses it, then it's not going to help address these issues. So it is an important step.
And I'd like to add, I mean, I want the truth. I believe in autonomous vehicle technology, but I want the data to support that. So if we're collecting data on traffic accidents, otherwise, the only way we're going to be able to shift public opinion is to show them a true comparison. And then the other benefit of that also is, in collecting that data, we're also able to feed information back to the developers of this technology, and hopefully we can really refine where any particular problem points are that need to be addressed or improved. It's going to be much easier to enhance the ability for AVs to deal with certain traffic situations than it is to, try to retrain each and every human driver that's licensed in this country.
And Alante, did you have something you wanted to add on this?
No, I think Ariel and Anil did a great job.
All right. So let's move on to talking about the potential of AVs to support increased equity. And, I think we can think about equity in a number of different ways. We can think about it in terms of class. Low-income people are much less likely to have access to mobility than people who have higher incomes, because they have harder time getting into be able to access cars. People of color have less access to the transportation system than white people throughout the United States. And people with disabilities have significant problems getting access to transportation under the current system. So I would like to hear from all of you, if you could, to give me one reason why you think AVs could expand on one of those modes of equity, and one reason why you're concerned, or something that you think needs to be regulated or thought of when it comes to AVs that could help address potential challenges when it comes to equity. So I'll begin with you, Hillary.
Yeah, perfect. And I love that we're talking about this because I do think there is incredible opportunity with autonomous vehicles to make some, significant strides in the equity space. I really think that this is about increasing access. A couple of ways that I think that this can work is, there are a lot of communities that are essentially transit deserts, right, that don't have access to public transportation. And so I do see autonomous vehicles potentially providing alternative transportation solutions in those communities. I also think that there are a number of communities that are close to public transit systems, but not immediately, within them. And so AVs have an opportunity also to serve as sort of appendages, right, to public transportation systems and help people get into those systems. I also think, and I kind of hinted at this before a little bit, but I do think there's also an opportunity for increased access to groceries and other goods in communities that maybe don't have grocery stores or pharmacies or things like that. This is a way to get goods to those communities. So those are a few examples. I do think that there's a lot that we need to be thinking about in order to foster the equity opportunities with autonomous vehicles. I think a couple of ideas we have is I do think we need a consistent framework and metric for assessing equity across transportation modes. What do we mean by equity? How can we measure it? And then we can, look at various modes and see which ones are more equitable. And then I do think that as we roll this technology out, that we should assess how AVs are impacting transportation equity as compared to other modes. And that last piece is really, really important here. And I just want to emphasize it. I think the real question is not whether AVs are equitable, but are AVs more equitable than existing transportation options? And if the answer to that question is yes, that's good and that's progress.
Anil?
So to build on that, two perspectives. As a Black male that grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, I lived in inner city neighborhoods which had access to public transportation, but I didn't have access to areas that public transportation wouldn't get me there, right? So that prohibited me from accessing jobs, specific entertainment venues, that kind of thing. So it's not even about just living in a transportation desert. It's about opening up the world to everybody equally. If you're talking about equity, that's what it's all about. And as a person with a disability, I cannot drive legally in this country, even though check blinddriverchallenge.org, you'll see blind guy driving on the Daytona International Speedway. But that's not what I'm advocating for here. I need to have the option of transportation, and my friends with disabilities who need a more accessible vehicle. I mean, I'm luckily able to take care of rideshare opportunities, but when I'm with a friend that uses a wheelchair, those opportunities are extremely limited. And the thing that's really important to understand is when we're talking about developing accessible autonomous vehicles, these vehicles are not just for people with disabilities. These vehicles, everybody can use them. I don't understand why people would be resistant to having access to a vehicle that everybody can use. And if you need to have the selfish perspective around it, it's also a vehicle that you, in case you ever become disabled or even temporarily disabled, will also be able to use. Your life will also not be interrupted if you're having to walk with a broken leg or whatever. So just looking at the efficacy of all of that makes sense to me. My concern, and the report did a really good job of talking about all the benefits of autonomous vehicle. But the thing that it also did was it says that it's important. I mean, this is only possible if we're intentional really about doing it. So the way that we implement it is really going to be key. So my concern is that not enough people will be intentional about the aspects of the autonomous vehicles that I find, or the millions of people with disabilities find important about this evolution of technology.
Ariel?
Sure, I agree with all of that. So let me start there and then try and be additive and not repetitive. So building on that, not to certainly starting there, I'll just mention a couple of things in addition. One is when we look at the statistics, safety is equity. There's just a disproportionate, just enormously disproportionate impact on communities of color when it comes to safety, and particularly in pedestrian fatalities and injuries. And so anything we can do to address the safety question is going to be looking at equity. The second item, which we haven't talked about a lot, is on the economic growth piece. That building opportunities in a number of different ways. And here I'll turn a little bit to the autonomous trucking side with so many different, as was shown in a macroeconomic study done by USDOT and Volpe and other studies as well. The kinds of jobs that are already being created. These are new kinds of jobs. They don't require a college degree. There's an educational accessibility for all Americans to become part of this ecosystem. And I think that's an important aspect. In addition to the economic growth that results in lower prices of consumer goods and increased wages. All of these things have been shown to accrue to society from the deployment of autonomous trucks and autonomous cars. And then finally, I know given the nature of the organization we're here for, I do have to mention the rural aspect, maybe a little dissonant with our gracious hosts here, but that is something that's very important. And when you talk about extending agricultural markets and just the obvious reasons of being able to travel long distances for folks with vision impairments and other disabilities and older Americans and so forth, very critical. So those are just 3 additional things I mentioned.
Okay, thank you. And just to add quickly, I would say that there are some of my colleagues at the Urban Institute who work on rural issues. So I don't want to make them feel like they're excluded from this conversation.
Absolutely.
But let me finish with you, Alante, on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rest of my co-panelists really tackled that question quite thoroughly. From the from all the points. I just say that in my former life, prior to my role here, I looked at how autonomous vehicles can be a tool for increasing access and improving equity. And in that, I'd say that what's critical, I think, to this conversation in a way that increasing access and increasing equity includes ensuring that this technology is integrated with public transit. Or connected to public transit. So a private-public partnership between transit agencies and our AV companies, I think is going to be really a great key to unlock all of the potential there for increasing access.
Thank you. So I'd like to end this part of the conversation with a question about environmental sustainability. So as I noted in my presentation, there's been a lot of excitement about electric cars over the past few months with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which provides a lot of money to support electric car purchases. And, that could result in millions of Americans having electric cars that they own. But AVs could come as electric cars, but they could also be powered by fossil fuels. They could, be environmentally sustainable, or they don't have to be. There's nothing inherent about an AV that has to be environmentally sustainable. So I guess my question for the panelists is, what is the relationship there? And is there a role for example, state governments in promoting more environmentally sustainable vehicles as a key element of AV rollout? And I'll give Alante the chance to start with this.
Sure, I think that IRA really gave a really great incentive for our OEMs and some of our larger companies to think about how to electrify more of their fleet and as they're manufacturing, and with the idea that many of them will also have an autonomous vehicle in the future. I think that they go hand in hand. Additionally, I do think that autonomous vehicles being electrified is the way to go, and I'd say that many folks agree. I think we see that with the deployment, or at least the desire from multiple companies, right? Cruise, Zoox, a lot of these new vehicles that are purpose-built are electric and autonomous. And so I think there's already an acknowledgement there that's coming from industry. And of course, I think Ariel and Hillary know better than I do, but I think that's already there and something that's recognized as a bonus to creating kind of a all-around great narrative that says autonomous vehicles are safe, they can be sustainable, and there's all these other social benefits that we can unlock.
Anil?
Yeah, I just echo and amen that, because I think that, again, in trying to shape the hearts and minds of the public, attaching this to what the public concerns are, and we are in a space now where we're trying to be more environmentally responsible, and showing how this evolutionary technology is also fitting within that particular paradigm only serves to help us move the development and implementation faster.
Hillary?
Yeah, it's funny. If you had asked me this question 3 years ago about environmental sustainability, I probably would have focused on, reduced crashes and how crashes contribute to congestion, and, an answer there. And now I think what you've seen over the last couple of years is a full-blown commitment from the auto industry to transition to a zero-emission fleet. And I fully expect that autonomous vehicles are going to follow that same pathway. So, I think in the not too distant future, most, if not all, AVs will be zero-emission vehicles.
And Ariel, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just quickly, a number of AV companies have made commitments to electrify their fleets, but as I think a lot of people know here, it's not binary whether to go electric or not. We just need to remember, and I work with the Autonomous Vehicle Industry Association, which takes a holistic approach to different use cases, light duty vehicles, heavy duty, medium duty trucking, zero occupant last mile delivery, shuttles, and things like that. And when you start to add up the the kinds of benefits from an environmental perspective that accrue even before we look at everything being fully electric, whether it's a reduction in VMT because of ride hail or goods delivery last mile. Those are certainly almost exclusively electric low-speed vehicles that have been shown to reduce CO2 emissions at a very large scale. And then the fuel efficiency savings from this more efficient driving, lane centering, and so forth. These are not insignificant developments that we should be embracing and supporting, even if and before there's a complete shift to electrification. So that's very important to not lose sight of that.
All right, thank you so much. So now we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. Feel free to put any questions you have into the Q&A. And I see that we already have more than a dozen questions. So I'll go ahead and start asking some of these. Sorry if you don't get to yours specifically, but when I ask the question, panelists, feel free to just go ahead and answer in the order that you wish. If you have nothing to say, no problem. So I'm actually going to begin with, and I'll paraphrase some of these questions, but I'm going to begin with one from Tara Goddard, who points out that there are a lot of issues with pedestrian safety, specifically in the automotive system. And, there's a lot of concern that the way vehicles are currently designed and the way streets are designed are not necessarily contributing to positive outcomes for pedestrians. I'm wondering whether you think that there are particular roles for the federal government, state governments, and local governments to try to address pedestrian safety and what it would look like in the context of AVs.
Well, I'd offer not necessarily in the context of the question, but the hidden value of implementation of autonomous vehicle technology. I think a lot of people look at it as just the car itself, but the technology itself is going to allow the vehicles to talk to vehicles, V2V. They're going to have the vehicles being able to communicate. It's going to alter the pedestrian infrastructure. It's also important to understand that these vehicles have technology that allows them to have a 365 view of the road. So it's not just limited by a person checking their blind spot. So it's going to allow the infrastructure, not only just the vehicles, but the infrastructure to change in a way that makes it safer for pedestrians to navigate through these environments.
Yeah, I mean, I might add that, obviously there is a really significant pedestrian traffic fatality crisis in this country. And I think there's a lot of attention on this topic right now, as there should be, and that it is going to take a lot of different players working together to try to figure out how to bring these numbers down. I will say, though, linking to the purpose of this discussion today, is I do think that there's a role for technology. I think, that technology at the end of the day is going to likely do a better job than us as human drivers at detecting pedestrians and stopping before there is a collision. And so I think we should be excited about the opportunity to see reductions in pedestrian traffic fatalities using these sorts of technologies.
Great. Well, one thing that we found in some of our research at the Urban Institute is that a lot of other countries have been more successful in reducing pedestrian deaths by prioritizing pedestrians in the design of streets, such as by actually creating areas of neighborhoods where vehicles are not allowed to enter. And I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts about potentially using sort of automated control systems in AVs to say, okay, well, this street is going to be off limits to cars, and we can sort of enforce that automatically without allowing cars to go through spaces that might intervene on a popular pedestrian area, for example.
Sure. I mean, I support that. And again, I feel like I'm the AV evangelist here. It's going to be easier to implement that through the use of the technology, because, when you go into the problem of having barriers put up that have a human driver not going to certain areas, I've seen drivers, just ignore those barriers. It's going to be easier to kind of implement that particular traffic intervention, I would think.
Well, I'll just add, it's adjacent to another, the topic of overall urban planning. When we're talking about autonomous electric ride-hail fleet, being able to drop off and drive away, it opens up opportunities for, there's not much of a need for parking. which, and these things have been discussed for many years now, but it speaks to that. And I think it's all about the opportunities to improve that kind of living in those dense urban environments. So this would potentially be another one, but I want to give it some more thought.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about data. So we had a question from Arya Grossman, who asks, whether there is too much data collection or maybe not enough data collection. And I personally am wondering whether you all think that AVs, because of the fact that they're, for example, covered with cameras, raise potential privacy concerns for people in vehicles and people outside vehicles. How do we think about that from the perspective of making sure that people have the ability to sort of walk around or use transportation without feeling like they're being spied upon?
Here I am jumping back in first. I think that's a red herring. I got my smartphone right here. Everywhere I go, I could point my camera in any direction. If people are concerned about that as a security, safety, I mean, you got to stay at home. There's so many people out there with the ability to film and record. It's not AVs that are out there doing it solely.
And I say the privacy conversation, I think, is incredibly important. That is not necessarily within my scope, but the conversation thought about data and how many data points we can collect from these vehicles. I think that we're going to have to strike a balance, because if we collect all the data, who's going to process it? Who's going to have the time and capacity to actually pull something useful from it, right? I know if we collect too many things, and we can't really create anything that's actually useful and helpful. And the point of data collection is to make more informed decisions. And so I think we have to think carefully about what information we need, what we can actually process, and then make informed decisions with it.
Yeah, very good point.
Yeah, I will also add that, so first of all, privacy considerations are not unique to autonomous vehicles, right? There's a broader conversation to be had about privacy and vehicles generally, and it's something that the auto industry takes very, very seriously. And there is, in fact, in case folks don't know, there is a privacy code of conduct that the auto industry released back in 2014. So we've now been living under it for almost a decade, that does place very significant restrictions on how auto companies can use vehicle generated data, restrictions on sharing with third parties in the absence of affirmative consent, restrictions on marketing in the absence of affirmative consent. And I note these because the privacy principles are not unique to vehicles that are on the road. This privacy code of conduct is not unique to vehicles on the road today, but is something that they've committed to sort of more generally for future vehicle technology as well.
Totally agree with that. And the same as similar is true of cybersecurity issues. This is, it's not unique to AVs. So I agree.
Okay, great. And just one final question, which really came up a lot in our research, which is that if AVs reduce the cost of travel, the concern is that people will just drive more. And that could have some really negative impacts in terms of congestion, in terms of contributing to urban sprawl. How do you all think about that? Are there strategies that could help address the potential increase in vehicle miles from autonomous vehicles?
I definitely think so. I noted the point about integrating with public transit, but I know that's one solution that supports not only increasing access, but also incentivizing shared use of autonomous vehicles, which I think also is going to be really critical. I know it's not going to be appropriate in every circumstance for shared vehicles to be the solution, but I think when it is, we should absolutely do our best to facilitate and incentivize folks towards a shared service, so that we can also start to address the VMT concerns, the emissions concerns, again, laid on top of our zero emission vehicles. I think that's how we really get all those positive benefits.
All right, well, I'm going to let you have the last thought, Alante, because we are at 4 p.m. Eastern, and I really appreciate everybody taking the time to join us today, both attendees and panelists. Thank you so much. I thought that was a really interesting conversation. For everybody out there, we will have a recording of this online, and our report is also available online. So thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.